What is spiritual abuse? And what are the signs that you might be in a spiritually abusive relationship or environment? Maybe you're in a spiritual community or ministry or organization that professes to love and serve God. It's doing great works and many people are blessed, but something feels deeply wrong to the core, and you feel it in your body and in your emotions, and you're wondering how to deal with it. Maybe you're experiencing some disillusionment already. In this video, I'm going to delve into 10 subtle, insidious signs of spiritual abuse and what you can do if you find yourself in that situation. Now first, before we get into it, for those of you who are new to my channel, welcome. I'm Shaneen Megji. Welcome to my channel on Toxicity is Not Your Destiny. My mission is to help people navigate narcissistic relationships in their lives from a biblical, practical, and spiritual perspective. So if you'd like to hear regular content from me shared from that viewpoint to empower you in those relationships, subscribe to my channel. Now let's get into it. What is spiritual abuse? Spiritual abuse is when a shepherd or a leader feeds off of the sheep that they are entrusted to care for. It is when they use the scriptures, their faith, the systems they create, and the things they teach as a means to control, to harm, or exploit others to satisfy their own agenda or needs. Spiritual abuse is a betrayal of the sacred trust that people place in spiritual leaders. It undermines the very foundation of the faith, and it exploits the vulnerability of people who are seeking to have a genuine connection with God. And this kind of abuse is especially damaging because it is deceptive, and it can look good and pious and spiritual on the outside, but it is completely dark and diabolical on the inside. These spiritual abusers are wolves in sheep's clothing that Jesus warns about in the Bible. He says, "Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves." These types of people do not feed God's people, but prey on them. So understand this, spiritual abusers are not in ministry to serve. They use the ministry as a means to feed themselves. And sadly, we're seeing more and more of it. So it's so important to address it in these times because Jesus warns that many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. And those prophets that are not aligned with Jesus Christ and do not seek to be men and women after God's own heart and dedicating their lives to be conformed into the image of Christ may have agendas for what they do. And Jesus warns us to be aware of such people. He also calls them blind guides. He said about the religious leaders and the Pharisees who are walking in hypocrisy, "Leave them, they are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into the pit." So it's important to take these matters very seriously because who you allow yourself to be influenced and led by can affect your destiny. So I'm going to share 10 very subtle and insidious signs to watch out for. And I hope that by sharing them, they will keep you from falling into a pit with a blind leader. I also want to mention that if a leader or a person engages in one or a few of these subtle signs I'm about to share from time to time, it doesn't mean that they are a wolf in sheep's clothing. It may not mean that they're a great leader. They may have some character issues that they need to work through and maybe making some bad choices here and there from which they need to repent from. When I talk about subtle signs, I'm referring to certain people who are practicing many of these signs and are stealth in their manner of doing it. They may appear to be pious, but their modus operandi is to engage in deceptive practices. And it's these types of people that are very dangerous since they have the potential to erode the foundations of a person's beliefs. In other words, their practices can shipwreck people's faith. So here's the first one: manipulation and control. A religious leader may use coercive tactics to control the beliefs, behaviors, and decisions of followers. And a big way to know if there's manipulation and control is to observe how the religious leader handles being questioned. A spiritually abusive leader might say or imply to their followers that questioning their teachings is a sign of weak faith or disobedience to God or dishonor to them. Or they might teach that questioning their authority will lead to God's discipline or punishment because it's a form of challenging their authority. So for these reasons, A leader like this may discourage independent thinking and promote blind obedience to their directives. And if a leader succeeds at getting a whole community of people believing this, it won't be long before manipulation creates a culture where people feel guilty and fearful for even asking questions. So how might this subtly play out? Here are some examples. Let's say a leader expresses anger or disappointment or sadness when someone disagrees or raises concerns. Or they share stories or examples of people who suffered negative outcomes for questioning their authority. Or they assert that questioning the leader is equivalent to questioning God's plan. Or if the leader or person rewards those who conform while subtly excluding or marginalizing people who dissent towards them. Or if they reinforce the idea that loyalty to the leader is paramount and that questioning disrupts the group's unity. So all these examples are signs of a leader operating out of manipulation and control rather than by the leading of God. To contrast, a healthy leader is submitted to the leadership of Jesus Christ and understands that Jesus is the head of the spiritual community or the church or the ministry. And so they are more preoccupied with doing God's will, even if it means a loss for them or them not looking as great, than trying to take matters into their own hands to get their own needs and agenda met. A healthy spiritual leader is committed to walking out the God connections and relationships that God brings into their lives, even if those people rub them the wrong way at times and challenges them, even if they have to surround themselves with people who are more gifted or intelligent than them. But they understand that they need these people with complementary strengths and giftings around them. They need their input in order for those people to help them see their blind spots and in order for that team to be able to do what God has called that team or that ministry or organization to do. A second red flag is guilt and shame. Followers are made to feel guilty about normal aspects of their humanity, such as having personal ambitions that are not in the interests of the leader or organization, or perhaps how they spend their time, who they associate with, who they work for, what they choose to do to make a living. And they may be told by the leader that only by adhering strictly to their rules can they find God's approval of them. So how might inflicting guilt and shame play out in a spiritually abusive community or organization? Here are some examples. The leader might pit members against each other by highlighting the achievements of one and the failings of the other. They may publicly single out the other and be critical of them. The members who have not met certain expectations, which could cause those people to feel embarrassed and feel ashamed. They may blame individual members for any negative outcomes or setbacks experienced by the whole group. They may create an environment where those who think independently or have differing opinions are ostracized, which could induce guilt for going against the group. All these examples are signs of a leader using guilt and shame in order to exert power and control over people. A healthy, Christ-centered leader, on the other hand, is not insecure and does not have a need to deflect off themselves to the weaknesses and flaws of others. They have no trouble acknowledging their weaknesses, and they're humble. They have the capacity to have compassion and empathy for the struggles of others, and they inspire them to go higher. The third red flag is exploitation. This type of leader may target vulnerable individuals, such as those dealing with emotional trauma or life crises, and exploit their trust for personal gain. And so they may offer them false promises of prosperity and blessings, or tell them that they'll get God's special favor, or they might give them a special spiritual elite status. So they manipulate these individuals this way into unquestioning loyalty. And this exploitation of trust only amplifies the vulnerabilities of the people who are seeking spiritual support. So how might this play out in a spiritual environment? Here are some examples to watch out for. A leader might use their position to subtly manipulate followers to donate significant amounts of money to fund the leader's luxurious lifestyle and promising spiritual rewards in return. A spiritual leader might take advantage of the trust and dedication of followers by requiring them to work excessive long hours. They might demand unpaid labor or use followers to advance their personal business ventures under the guise of serving a higher purpose. These types of leaders view their followers as objects and commodities that belong to them and therefore must function through them, instead of seeing their followers as fellow brothers and sisters in the faith who have their own unique callings and destinies and relationships with God. The difference between an abusive spiritual leader and one who is serving God is that the spiritually abusive leader extracts resources from their followers, whether it be money, labor, time, resources, and they do it in a way that is either deceptive, manipulative, or that damages or harms or exploits the well-being of their followers. In contrast, a leader devoted to serving God operates with transparency and integrity and a genuine concern for the welfare of their followers. Instead of extracting resources, a healthy leader encourages voluntary contributions, and they foster an environment where there's mutual growth and support. Their focus is ultimately on doing the will of God, as well as caring for people and empowering them to grow. The fourth red flag is demanding unwavering loyalty to the leader over loyalty to the truth. Followers are subtly instructed that their love and devotion to the leader must supersede their love for truth. And this expectation creates an environment where individuals may unknowingly fall into idolatry, where they place the leader on a pedestal above God. How might this play out? Here are some examples to watch out for. If you see leaders or members turning a blind eye to the sinful actions, abuse, or scandals involving the leader to protect the reputation of the community, that's a red flag. If reporting or acknowledging such incidents might be discouraged or dismissed to maintain the image of the leader, a red flag. Or maybe information that reflects negatively on the leader is being withheld or manipulated to present a more favorable narrative. It's possible in that organization that transparency is being sacrificed to protect the leader's image, which leads to a distorted view of the truth. Maybe the leadership structure lacks mechanisms for holding the leader accountable for their actions, and loyalty to the leader might be preventing the implementation of checks and balances, allowing certain misconducts to go unchecked. And maybe there's an environment where loyalty to the leader is fostering this us versus them mentality, where anyone critical of the leader is viewed as an outsider or an enemy. And this divisive mindset is what's discouraging open dialogue and preventing the community from addressing any real legitimate concerns. In a healthy spiritual community, the commitment to truth and walking in integrity and transparency takes precedent over unwavering loyalty to the leader. The fifth subtle sign of spiritual abuse is when a leader twists the scriptures or puts disproportionate weight on some and not enough on others. In a spiritually abusive setting, a leader might manipulate the Bible or their teachings to advance their personal agenda. They may cherry pick verses or take certain teachings out of context to create a distorted interpretation that aligns with their interests. For instance, they might emphasize certain verses to promote obedience and submission while neglecting all the verses in the Bible that encourage questioning and critical thinking and independent evaluation. In a spiritually abusive environment, a leader might take biblical teachings out of context to justify abusive behavior. The leader might assume that their preferences and their thoughts are God's preferences and thoughts. They might take a very harsh Old Testament law approach to interpreting the Bible, rather than taking a Christ-centered approach. In contrast, a Christ-centered leader understands that the sum of God's word is truth and is committed to studying and integrating all aspects of the Bible's teachings, even verses that cause discomfort and create tensions. They have a heart and a love for wisdom and understanding, and they also have a deep passion and commitment to understand and interpret the Bible in a way that is Christ-centered and Spirit-led. The sixth subtle sign of spiritual abuse is lack of financial transparency. If your spiritual leader withholds crucial information about the budget allocations, or they leave their followers in the dark about how funds are spent, well, that's a red flag. And Jesus said that the love of money is the root of many kinds of evils. A lot of times you can determine the corruption level of an organization by simply following the money. So how might lack of financial transparency subtly play out? Here are some examples to watch for. The leader doesn't give any clarity about how their financial decisions are aligned with the values of the community. They may be spending money based on their agenda and interests rather than what they committed to spend the money on to their donors and stakeholders. In contrast, a Christ-centered leader is committed to financial transparency. They openly communicate all financial matters within the community. They ensure transparency in their budget allocations. The funds are used for the rightful causes, and the financial decisions align with the shared values of the community and the organization. The leaders refrain from indulging in luxurious lifestyles at the expense and exploitation of the people that they're serving. The seventh red flag is fear and intimidation. In spiritually abusive settings, a leader may use fear and intimidation tactics by threatening severe consequences for people who attempt to leave the group. They might threaten that anyone who leaves the group will forfeit their high callings or their destinies, or they will displease God forever, or it will be over for them, or they will lose all the benefits and relationships that they had in that community. And that can look like being shunned or ostracized or excommunicated by the group. By instilling fear of these consequences, followers are coerced into silence, which prevents them from expressing doubts or seeking alternative perspectives. Now, a healthy spiritual leader is dedicated to healthy practices and does not condemn or reject people for leaving. They don't feel betrayed by another person's departure. They still keep relational bridges open and don't discourage members of their church or ministry from associating with people who have left before. These people are secure and have a bigger focus and a bigger vision. They think bigger picture. The eighth subtle sign of spiritual abuse is isolation. Spiritually abusive leaders use this tactic to isolate in order to create dependence on the leader, to limit exposure to alternative viewpoints and external support systems. So how might this play out? Here are some examples to watch out for. A leader might encourage his or her followers to rely on them for guidance and make them feel incapable of making decisions without their input. They might assert that the community is the exclusive place for true spiritual growth. To that end, they might tell their followers not to read certain books or visit websites or engage in conversations with certain people that challenge the group's beliefs. They may present any negative reviews as orchestrated attacks against the group's divine mission. The leader might encourage their members to sever ties with friends and family outside the group, claiming that those that are not part of the faith are agents of evil. They might encourage members to share personal struggles exclusively within the group and discourage seeking support elsewhere. They may reframe any criticism or questioning from external sources as persecution against the group. In contrast, healthy leadership values diversity of thought. Instead of trying to control what outside sources their followers listen to, they instead encourage their followers to walk in wisdom and seek after understanding and truth. They don't believe that all truth and understanding resides with them. The ninth red flag is conditional love. In spiritually abusive settings, a leader might use conditional love as a manipulative tool to control their followers. The leader might offer love, acceptance, and approval only when the followers conform to their specific expectations or follow their directives. This conditional love can create a toxic environment where people feel afraid of losing the approval of the spiritual leader. So here are some examples of what this could look like. The leader might subtly withhold praise, attention, or communal support from people who don't stick to their path of how they want them to live or behave. And this kind of manipulation can really mess with people's head and cause them to live in this fear of losing the love and the attention and the approval that they crave. And so the leader maintains control by maintaining this dependency on their conditional expressions of love. And this can take a real psychological and emotional toll on people within the community. Now, on the other hand, a healthy leader would strive to create an environment and culture where there's unconditional love and belonging, because their desire and their commitment is to emulate God's heart towards people in their ministry and organization. And it's those kinds of ministries and organizations that do much better because people are loyal and they stay in places like that. Those kinds of places don't become revolving doors. And number Number 10, manipulating and interpreting of prophecies and dreams. In certain prophetic or charismatic churches and ministries, the way a spiritual leader interprets prophecies, visions, and dreams can sometimes become a subtle form of control and manipulation. So I'll just clarify that the mere act of receiving or sharing dreams, prophecies, or visions is not inherently a form of spiritual abuse. The issue is really when leaders use their interpretation of their spiritual experiences to advance their personal agenda rather than conveying the authentic message that God intended. And I'm not talking about leaders who are sincere to serve and might get the interpretation wrong here and there, or they might just be inexperienced in the interpretation of God's enigmas and dreams and prophecies. I'm talking about leaders who are chronically not interested nor willing to search out God's perspective, but believe that their perspective in all things is God's perspective, and therefore they manipulate or embellish the revelations they or others receive to control individuals or situations instead of communicating the pure, unfiltered message that God intended. A person might try to control or manipulate another person by also saying things like, God told me, and this kind of language can really set a person up on the receiving end not to be able to question or challenge that word, because as soon as someone says, God told me, then who can argue with God? But Scripture tells us very clearly to test every spirit to see if it's from God. But a leader who insists on using the language God told me to convey messages to people could cross into the realm of manipulation, control, and witchcraft, since they leave no room for that person to judge and no room for their own human fallibility to get the message wrong. A healthy, Christ-centered leader may not be perfect, but they are always seeking for God's heart and mind and want to convey that in their messages above and beyond their own interests. They will not use terms like God told me, but may say instead, I'm sensing from God, or I believe God is saying. So it leaves room for them to be fallible and possibly get it wrong, and also makes room for the other person to judge if what they are hearing is coming from God. Spiritual abuse often happens like the frog in a boiling pot. That is, the spiritual abuser will never put out all their cards at once. They are subtle and devious. A wolf has to look like a sheep or look like one of the people they are abusing in order to be effective, and that is part of the process. If a wolf did not look like a sheep, or if Satan did not look like an angel of light, then they would be easy to spot. A wolf has to conceal themselves in order to get what they want out of people. At the end of the day, spiritual abuse is all about a leader or a person seeking to control others outside of the influence of God and outside of the rule of Jesus Christ. Spiritual abuse is when a person assumes God's position or acts outside of how God would think or feel, and instead employs their feelings to control and accomplish their own agenda outside of God's will. It is very serious. God is not mocked, and He judges His leaders and teachers more harshly and strictly. So I hope this video was helpful. Shifting gears, if you'd like to receive regular content from me, click the subscribe button. And also, I have some free, valuable resources to share with you. Check out my free training on how to navigate a difficult, high-impact life transition in the description box below. Everything in that training are things that help me to have a breakthrough. Also, I have a free ebook on 7 red flags to spot a narcissist. You can check that out also. And this brings me to the end of my video. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.